surgeon performed a routine checkup at the hospital Gala until he saw his ex across the room, holding a little boy with his own eyes. Welcome to Mr. Harrison Stories. Before we begin, drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories reach. When the story ends, rate it from 0 to 10 and tell us what you felt. And if you love stories about second chances and hidden truths, make sure you follow Mr. Harrison Stories so you don't miss what comes next. Now sit back, relax, and let this one take you somewhere real. The ballroom of St. Clement's Hospital smelled like money and fresh flowers, and the particular kind of ambition that only comes out after dark. Chandelier light bounced off champagne flutes and pearl necklaces, and the carefully maintained smiles of people who had spent decades learning how to look effortless. Dr. Colton Reeves moved through it all, with the ease of someone who had been trained for rooms like this since childhood, shoulders back, grip firm, eye contact steady, the same way he'd been trained to deliver difficult diagnoses without flinching. At 42, Colton was the kind of man people described before they described anything else about a room. 6'1", dark eyes that missed nothing, the kind of jaw that made medical students nervous when he walked into a teaching session. He was the chief of cardiac surgery at St. Clement's, the youngest in the hospital's history, and the evening's honoree. 10 years of department leadership, 3 published breakthroughs in minimally invasive procedures, a wing of the hospital that bore the Reeves Foundation name in brushed steel lettering above the entrance. He had everything, and he moved through the crowd knowing it, nodding at donors, laughing at the right moments, touching his fiancée Diana's elbow when she introduced him to someone whose last name he should remember. Diana Whitmore was extraordinary on paper. Harvard Law, a senior partner at 40, the daughter of a federal judge whose name appeared in the kind of newspapers that got framed. She wore tonight's gown like she'd been born in it. Ice. Blue silk, her dark hair pinned at the neck with a single pearl clip. She had never, in the 2 years Colton had known her, said the wrong thing at a party. "You're distracted," she murmured, not looking at him, still smiling at the deputy mayor across the room. "I'm always distracted at these things," Colton said. "You're usually better at hiding it." He laughed because that was the right response. And she squeezed his arm because that was hers, and they continued moving through the ballroom like 2 satellites in a very elegant orbit. The truth was, Colton had felt hollow since sometime around last February, maybe longer. The kind of hollow that's easy to miss when your schedule runs from 5 a.m. rounds to 9 p.m. board calls, when you have a fiancé who handles the wedding planning between depositions, when the noise of a successful life fills every room you enter before you can hear the quiet underneath. He stopped at the edge of the crowd near the open terrace doors, accepting a glass of sparkling water from a passing server, letting himself breathe for a moment. The October air coming in from outside smelled like damp leaves and the Hudson. That's when he saw her. She was standing near the far end of the room beside a silent auction table, studying a framed photograph of the hospital's new pediatric wing. Her dark hair fell loose past her shoulders. She wore a simple burgundy dress, nothing dramatic, nothing that asked the room for attention, and she was smiling slightly at the photograph, the private kind of smile that had nothing to do with anyone watching. Colton's water glass stopped halfway to his lips. Sylvie Marchetti. After 4 years, she looked the same and completely different, the way people do when time has agreed with them. There were small changes, something steadier in the way she held herself, a confidence that had replaced the quiet nervousness he remembered from the night everything fell apart, but the way she tilted her head at something that interested her, the slight press of her lips when she was thinking, those were exactly the same, and recognizing them did something unpleasant to Colton's chest. He had not thought of Sylvie in months. He had worked very hard not to think of Sylvie in months. And now she was 30 feet away at his hospital Gala, wearing burgundy, and looking at a photograph like she had every right to be here, which she probably did, because Sylvie had always gone where she had every right to go, and never apologized for it. Colton was still processing this when he noticed the boy. He was small. 4, maybe 5 years old. Tucked against Sylvie's side, with one hand wrapped in the fabric of her dress, dark hair, serious expression, the way children get when they're quietly absorbing everything around them. He was looking at the photograph with his head tilted at exactly the same angle as his mother. The angle, the dark hair, the serious absorbing expression. Colton felt his world tilt. The math arrived without his permission. 4 years since Sylvie left. The boy looked 4, maybe older. 4 years since the night she'd tried to tell him something and he'd been too preoccupied, too absent, too caught up in the Breslin merger and the department review, and his mother's running commentary on whether Sylvie was the right kind of person, to actually hear her. Colton. Diana peered at his elbow. Senator Marsh wants a photo. Give me a minute. Diana followed his gaze across the room and something shifted in her expression. Not dramatically, just a small recalibration, the way a very intelligent person adjusts when new information arrives. Who is that? Someone I used to know, Colton said. It was the most honest thing he'd said all evening. Sylvie chose that moment to look up from the photograph. Their eyes met across the ballroom, and Colton watched 4 years compress into nothing. Her expression moved through recognition, then something that looked like fear, then something deliberate and controlled, that closed over both of them like a curtain coming down. She looked away immediately. Her hand found the boy's shoulder, and she began moving slowly toward the exit. "Excuse me," Colton said. "Colton." Diana's voice followed him, but he was already moving. He didn't run. He walked the way he walked into difficult situations in the operating room, with purpose and without theatrics. By the time he reached the terrace exit, Sylvie was already outside, standing near the stone railing with the city lights spread out below them, and the boy pressed close to her side. "Sylvie," she turned. Her expression was composed now, the fear gone or deeply buried. "Colton." He stopped a few feet away, aware of the boy watching him with those serious eyes. Up close, it was worse. The child had Sylvie's nose and her mouth, but the eyes, the particular shape of them, the color, were a mirror. Colton hadn't expected to stand in front of tonight. "I didn't know you'd be here," she said. "It's my hospital." "I know." She looked out at the city. "I'm here with Dr. Okafor's team. We've been consulting on the pediatric cardiology expansion." A pause. "I'm a pediatric nurse practitioner now. I've been working with St. Clement's for 6 months. 6 months. She had been working inside his hospital for 6 months and he had never seen her. He looked at the boy. "What's his name?" Sylvie was quiet for a moment, not hesitating exactly, more like deciding how much ground to give. "Theo," she said. Colton crouched down to the boy's eye level, the same way he did with small patients when he didn't want them to feel small. Theo watched him with an expression that was startlingly adult, not afraid, just measuring. "Hi, Theo," Colton said. "I'm Colton." "I know," Theo said. "You're the doctor, whose name is on the building." Colton felt something tighten in his throat. "That's right." Theo considered him for another moment, then said with the particular gravity of a child who has spent a lot of time around adults, "Mama said we might see you tonight." Colton looked up at Sylvie. She was watching him with an expression that held no apology and no accusation, just the steady gaze of someone who had already survived the hardest part and was waiting to see what came next. "We should talk," Colton said. "Yes," Sylvie agreed, "we should." Share your thoughts in the comments below. Did Sylvie do the right thing? And if you were Colton, what would you do next? Keep watching. Colton did not sleep that night. He sat in the leather chair in his home office, with a glass of scotch he never touched, and the city laid out through the window like a question he didn't know how to answer. Theo, 4 years old. Mama said we might see you tonight. He opened his laptop and sat looking at the cursor for a long time before he did something he hadn't done in years. He searched for Sylvie. Not the way people search for someone they're missing, but the way they search for information they should have had all along and are only now realizing they were missing. What he found was not what he expected. Sylvie Marchetti, NP. Academic Publications in Pediatric Cardiac Care. A small but growing reputation in the field of congenital heart monitoring in young children. A profile on Clement's new consulting team. A 3-year-old article in a nursing journal about a practitioner who had rebuilt her career after personal upheaval with an intensity that surprised her colleagues and herself. He stared at the word rebuilt for a long time. He remembered the last night with a clarity that had been sitting underneath everything for 4 years, waiting for a moment like this to surface, They'd been together 2 years. He'd been in the middle of the most complicated stretch of his career, the cardiology department, restructuring, a high-profile malpractice case against a colleague that had everyone walking on eggshells, his mother's voice in his ear every Sunday, telling him that Sylvie was lovely, but not quite what the Reeves family needed in terms of long-term partnership. Sylvie had tried to talk to him. He remembered that clearly now, in the way you remember things you'd successfully buried. She'd waited up for him when he'd gotten home, past midnight. Sitting at the kitchen table of the apartment she spent more time in than her own. She'd looked nervous in a way he'd attributed to the hour, to the stress of his work bleeding into everything around them. He'd been distracted. Half his mind still on the surgical report he'd been reviewing in the car. She'd started to say something about her doctor's appointment. A follow-up, she'd said, for something she needed to tell him, and his phone had rung with the kind of ring he couldn't ignore. And he'd held up one finger, the universal physician signal, for just a moment, and taken the call. When he'd finished, 20 minutes later, Sylvie was quiet in a way that was different from her usual quiet. He'd asked if she was okay. She'd said she was tired. He'd believed her because it was easier, and because the surgical report was still half finished, and because believing her required nothing from him. 3 weeks later, she was gone. A note that said she hoped he built something that made him happy, and that she would always be grateful for the good parts. No anger, no dramatic exit. Just Sylvie doing the hard thing quietly, the way she did everything. He had told himself he'd respected her choice. He had told himself a great many things. Diana found him at 2 in the morning, still in the chair. She stood in the doorway in her silk robe and looked at him with the particular expression of a very intelligent woman who has already understood what's happening and is deciding how to respond. "You're not going to sleep," she said. "No. Who is she, Colton?" It wasn't a question. He appreciated that about Diana. Always, she didn't perform uncertainty she didn't have. "Someone I was with before you," he said. "For 2 years. She left and I didn't fight for it." Diana came into the room and sat across from him. She set her phone on the arm of the chair and looked at him steadily. "And the boy?" Colton looked at his hands. "I don't know yet, but I think I might." Diana was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was careful and controlled, the same voice she used in deposition prep. "What do you need to do? Talk to her." And then, "I don't know." Diana nodded slowly. She stood and picked up her phone and stood for a moment at the door. "Colton," she said, "I think we've been very good partners. I think we've been very sensible about everything." She paused. "I'm not sure sensible was ever going to be enough for either of us. I just needed one of us to say it first." She walked out quietly, which was the most Diana thing she could possibly have done. He sat for another hour looking at the city, and then he opened his phone and typed a message to a number he'd kept in his contacts for 4 years without ever using. "I know it's late. I know I have no right to reach out, but I can't stop thinking about tonight, and I'd like to talk if you're willing. Colton." He sent it before he could think too carefully about what it meant. The response came at 6:17 in the morning. One line: "Coffee Saturday. Theo has soccer at 9. Come at 10. I'll text you the address." Colton stared at the message until the sun finished rising. Then he canceled his Saturday morning lecture for the first time in 11 years and got ready for the most important conversation of his life. The address Sylvie sent was a small house in a neighborhood in Brooklyn, where the streets were narrow and lined with maple trees that were just starting to turn. It smelled like somebody was baking somewhere on the block. The houses had front stoops with potted plants and kids' chalk drawings on the sidewalk. It was nothing like any place Colton had ever lived or imagined living, and it looked more like a home than any place he'd ever been. He sat in his car for 8 minutes before going to the door. Sylvie answered before he knocked twice. She was wearing a plain gray sweater and her hair was still slightly damp at the ends, and she looked so normal and so specific, so entirely herself, that it took him a moment to find something to say. "Hi," he managed. "Hi," she said. "Come in." The house was small and full of things. A bookshelf in the entryway crammed with paperbacks and a small plastic stethoscope hanging off one shelf like a trophy. A coat rack with one adult coat and one small coat with a dinosaur patch on the sleeve. Crayon drawings paper-clipped to a string of lights in the kitchen. A handwritten grocery list on the counter, next to a half-finished cup of coffee that said "World's Okayest Mom" on the side. Sylvie poured him coffee without asking how he took it, because she still knew, and set it in front of him at the kitchen table. "He's at soccer," she said, sitting across from him. "My neighbor takes him Saturday mornings." "Sylvie." He put his hands around the coffee cup. "I need to ask you something. I know what you're going to ask. Is he mine?" She looked at him for a long moment. Not with anger, not with hesitation, just with the exhausted directness of someone who has been carrying a truth for a long time and is ready to put it down. "Yes," she said. "Theo is your son." The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere outside, a dog barked twice and stopped. Colton felt the room reorganize itself around a new center of gravity. His son who had told him he knew about the name on the building. His son who kept a plastic stethoscope on the bookshelf. "Why didn't you?" He stopped. "I know why." Sylvie wrapped both hands around her own mug. "Do you?" "The night you tried to tell me, the phone call." "That was the second time I tried," she said, very quietly. "The first time was a week earlier. You were reviewing charts and I started to say I'd seen a doctor. And you said you were glad because you'd been worried. I looked tired, and then your pager went off." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not saying that to hurt you. I'm saying it because I need you to understand that by the time I finally sat down at that table to tell you, I had already tried twice, and you took a phone call." The accuracy of this hit him like a diagnosis he'd already suspected, but hadn't wanted to confirm. "And then," she continued, "2 weeks after I left, I found out you were dating someone your mother approved of." Her voice didn't change. "I want to be clear that I'm not angry anymore. I worked through that. But I need you to understand what it felt like to be alone and pregnant, and to watch you move on while I was learning to give birth without anyone holding my hand." Colton felt something in his chest give way entirely. "Alone," he repeated. "My neighbor, Mrs. Delacroix, was with me. She's wonderful. But yes, Colton, alone." He pressed his hand over his mouth for a moment. Then he lowered it. "I'm sorry. I'm so Sylvie. I'm deeply, genuinely sorry. That night, and every night before it when I should have been paying attention and I wasn't." He looked at her. "I can't take any of it back. I know that. But I need you to know that if I had known." "What?" she asked, not cruelly, genuinely. "I would have been there. Would you?" She tilted her head. "Or would you have been there the way you were with me for 2 years? Present in the room, absent in the ways that mattered?" The truth of that landed harder than anything else she'd said. He didn't answer immediately. He sat with it the way he'd learned, eventually, to sit with hard things. "I don't know," he said finally. "I think I would have tried to be there the way I knew how to be then. And I think that would have been insufficient." Something shifted in her expression. He wasn't sure what. "You've gotten more honest," she said. "I've had 4 years to realize how dishonest I was being with myself." The front door opened and Theo came in at a run, cleats on, shin guards askew, mud on both knees, carrying a soccer ball like a trophy. He stopped when he saw Colton sitting at the kitchen table. He didn't look afraid. He looked like he was assessing a situation. "You came," Theo said. "I came," Colton said. Theo looked at his mother. Something passed between them, some private frequency developed between people who'd been each other's whole world. "Is he staying for lunch?" Theo asked. Sylvie looked at Colton. Colton looked at Theo. "That depends on your mother," Colton said. Theo dropped the soccer ball, pulled off his cleats with the focused effort of someone performing a very important task, and lined them up precisely next to the door. Then he came to the table and climbed into the chair beside Colton, and looked at him with those eyes. Colton's own eyes, very seriously. "I have a question," Theo said. "Go ahead. Why is it called cardiac surgery if the heart isn't actually a card?" Colton blinked. Then he laughed. Actually laughed, the kind that comes from somewhere unguarded. And Theo looked deeply satisfied with this result. "That," Colton said, "is a genuinely excellent question." "I have a lot of excellent questions," Theo said. "Mama says I inherited that." "She's right," Colton said, and looked across the table at Sylvie, who was watching her son with the kind of love that had no performance in it whatsoever. And he thought, "I have been in every important room in this city, and I have never been in a room that mattered as much as this kitchen." "You can stay for lunch," Sylvie said finally. If you want. Colton stayed for lunch. He stayed until Theo fell asleep on the couch, with a book about the human cardiovascular system open on his chest, and then he helped Sylvie wash dishes in the small kitchen, while the afternoon light came through the window above the sink, and the silence between them was the first comfortable silence he'd experienced in years. They had not resolved anything. They both knew that, but something had opened that had been closed for a very long time, and it smelled like dish soap and October light, and Colton drove home through Brooklyn, thinking that he had no idea what came next, and for the first time in his adult life, that uncertainty felt like the right thing to be standing in. His phone showed 2 missed calls from his mother when he got home. He turned it face down and sat with his coffee and thought about Theo's question about cardiac surgery and the small cleats lined up by the door, and Sylvie saying alone without flinching. And he understood with complete clarity that the life he'd been building had been built entirely by someone else's blueprint. It was time to draw his own. The following Tuesday, Colton walked into his office to find his mother sitting across from his desk. Eugenia Reeves was 71 and had the bearing of a woman who had never once second-guessed herself in public. She wore a pearl gray blazer and her silver hair was immaculate, and she looked at him over her reading glasses with the expression she'd been perfecting since he was old enough to disappoint her. "I heard about the gala," she said. Colton set down his bag and sat at his desk. "What did you hear?" "That you spent the evening distracted. That Diana has been quiet in a way she's never been quiet before. And that you were seen on the terrace talking to a woman and a small child." She folded her hands. "I know who she is, Colton. Do you? I know what you're considering. And I'm asking you to think very carefully before you allow sentiment to override everything you've built." Colton leaned back in his chair. He'd had this conversation before. Different words, same architecture. And for 42 years he'd let it land the way it was intended. As wisdom, as care, as the voice of someone who only wanted what was best for him. Today it landed differently. "Mom," he said, and something in his voice made her go very still. "I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. When Sylvie and I were together, did you know she had tried to call me before she left?" A pause. Very brief but present. "She may have tried to reach you," Eugenia said. "You were extremely busy. She left a message with your assistant," Colton said. He had spent the week going through things he'd been avoiding for years. Records, his old assistant's notes, a conversation with his college friend Darren, who'd been around during those years, and remembered more than Colton had asked him to. "She called your office when she couldn't reach me. She wanted to leave a message for me to call her back. It was urgent." The silence stretched. "I'm sure if I had known. Did you pass on the message, Mom?" Eugenia looked at him for a long time. Then she looked at the window. "I thought it was better," she said finally. "If there was a clean break. You were under enormous pressure. She wasn't the right fit for the life you were building." The room was very quiet. "She had a son," Colton said. "Alone. Because I didn't know. Because you made sure I didn't know. I didn't know about the child. But you made sure I couldn't be reached," Colton said. He kept his voice level with the same effort he used to keep his hands steady over open chests. "And the result is 4 years of my son's life that I wasn't in. Not because Sylvie kept him from me. Because I was surrounded by people, including you, who made it easier for me to look away than to see clearly." Eugenia opened her mouth. He held up one hand. "I'm not finished." It was the first time in his life he'd said that to her and meant it. "I love you. I know you believed you were protecting me. But what you protected me from was the life I was supposed to have. And I spent 4 years in a room that fit your idea of success. And Sylvie spent 4 years raising my son by herself, and I will not spend one more day acting like those two things are unconnected." His mother looked at him as if she was seeing him for the first time, and wasn't entirely sure she recognized the person in front of her. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Quietly for once. "I'm going to know my son," he said. "And I'm going to earn the right to be in his life. That's what I'm going to do." He called Sylvie that evening. She answered on the second ring. "I know something," he said, "about why you couldn't reach me before you left." A long pause. "How?" "I went back through things I should have looked at years ago. He kept his voice even. My mother's assistant had a log. Sylvie, I'm sorry doesn't cover it. But I need you to know that you weren't ignored, you were blocked. And if I had known that then, things would have been different. The quiet on the other end lasted long enough that he wasn't sure she would speak. I always wondered, she said finally, whether you knew and just didn't come. I didn't know. I believe you, she said, and the steadiness in her voice broke slightly for the first time. I believe you, Colton. They talked for 2 hours that night, not about the future. Neither of them was ready to make promises that big, but about Theo, about the things Colton had missed and the things he could still be present for. About Theo's obsession with the cardiovascular system, which had apparently started when Sylvie had shown him a diagram from one of her nursing textbooks, and he'd memorized it by the next morning. About how he lined his shoes up precisely every single time, and fell asleep in the middle of sentences when he was tired, and had recently announced that he planned to be both a paleontologist and a cardiologist, because he saw no reason to choose. He sounds like me, Colton said. He is you, Sylvie said, and he's entirely himself. Those two things can both be true. Colton sat in his home that night, really sat in it, for the first time in years, and looked at the clean, expensive, carefully assembled space around him, and thought about Theo's plastic stethoscope on the bookshelf, and the dinosaur patch on the small coat, and the grocery list that said "World's Okayest Mom." And he understood that he had been a very rich man, living a very small life. That was over. 3 weeks after the gala, Colton arrived at Theo's school for pickup. Sylvie had asked, carefully, whether he wanted to. He had said yes before she finished the sentence. He stood on the sidewalk with the other parents, hands in his coat pockets, feeling entirely out of his depth in the most clarifying possible way. The woman beside him was describing her son's soccer tournament. The man on his other side was on his phone, but smiled at Colton in the conspiratorial way parents do in school pickup lines. Colton smiled back, the doors opened and children streamed out, and then Theo appeared at the top of the steps, backpack enormous relative to his small frame, scanning the crowd with those serious eyes. When he found Colton, his face went through something, surprise, then something careful, then something wide open that he didn't entirely bother to hide. He walked down the steps with the dignity of someone very small, trying to walk the way they thought adults walked, and stopped in front of Colton. "Mama said you might come," Theo said. "I said I would," Colton replied. "People say things," Theo said, with a worldliness that should not have been possible in a 5-year-old. "I know," Colton said. "I'm here anyway." Theo studied him for a moment. Then he held out his hand. Not to be held exactly, but in the formal way a person extends their hand to someone they have decided to trust provisionally. Colton shook it. Then, apparently having decided that this arrangement was satisfactory, transferred the grip from handshake to held hand without comment, and began walking. "We're having soup for dinner," Theo announced. "I helped pick the vegetables yesterday. I chose parsnips because they're unusual." "I've never cooked with parsnips," Colton said. Theo looked up at him with something very close to pity. "That's because you probably eat at restaurants." "I do eat at restaurants. Mama says restaurants are fine, but they don't know what you actually like. Only people who love you know what you actually like." Colton felt the truth of that land directly in the center of his chest, the way the best truths do, quietly without ceremony, right where it mattered most. "Your mama," Colton said, "is very smart." "I know," Theo said. "I tell her that regularly so she doesn't forget." Colton laughed and Theo looked satisfied, and they walked the 3 blocks to Sylvie's house in the October afternoon with the maple leaves coming down around them, and the smell of someone's dinner already on the air. Sylvie was in the kitchen when they arrived, still in her scrubs from a shift that had run long, her hair pulled back with a pen still tucked behind one ear. She looked up when they came through the door, and her expression did something complicated and private when she saw Colton with Theo still holding his hand. "He chose parsnips," Colton said. "He always chooses parsnips," Sylvie said. "I think he does it to see if I'll actually cook them. I do it because parsnips are underrated," Theo said with enormous dignity and went to drop his backpack in his room. Colton stood in the kitchen doorway. Sylvie was stirring something on the stove, and the pen fell out from behind her ear and she caught it without looking. And it was such a small thing, such a normal and specific thing, and Colton thought, I have been pretending not to know what I was missing. And I cannot pretend anymore. Thank you, he said, for letting me come today. Sylvie set down the spoon. She looked at him the way she used to look at things that interested her, directly, without gloss. He needed to know you'd show up when you said you would, she said. That's the only way trust works with kids. Consistent, small, unremarkable follow-through. I know, Colton said. I'm going to do that. I know you're going to try, she said. That's different. You're right, he said. It's different. But I'm here. Today I'm here. Sylvie looked at him for a long time. Then she picked up the spoon again. Can you chop the carrots? I can, Colton said. Which was technically true, though practically untested. And she laughed, actually laughed, the full, unself-conscious laugh he remembered from years ago, and handed him a knife and pointed him toward the cutting board. He was still there when Theo reappeared in clean clothes, and announced that he intended to explain the pulmonary circulatory system over dinner because he'd been reading about it at school, and had concerns about how it was typically described in children's books. Sylvie said that sounded like an efficient use of mealtime. Colton said he was prepared to be corrected on any technical inaccuracies. Theo looked between them with the thoughtful expression of someone doing long-range planning. This is better, Theo announced, for no reason that anyone had articulated. What is? Sylvie asked. Theo sat down at the table and picked up his fork. When both people are here, he said simply, and looked at his soup, and the conversation moved on. But Colton and Sylvie looked at each other across the kitchen table, and something that had been broken for 4 years was not yet fixed, but was, for the first time, beginning to be. 6 weeks after the hospital gala, on a Saturday morning in late November, Colton arrived at Sylvie's, with 2 cups of coffee and a children's book about the human heart that he'd found in a hospital gift shop, and thought Theo might enjoy. He was 10 minutes early and stood on the stoop in the cold, breathing November air, holding coffee cups and a children's book, and thinking that he had never in his adult life felt so thoroughly unprepared for something, and so completely certain he was in the right place. The door opened before he knocked. Theo stood in the doorway in dinosaur pajamas, hair in impossible directions, holding his plastic stethoscope. You're early, Theo said. I know. Sorry, Theo considered him. It's okay. Early is better than late. He stepped back to let Colton in. Mama is making eggs. We have a rule that you can't talk about serious things before eggs. That sounds like an excellent rule. I made it up, Theo said with satisfaction. She thought it was good. Colton followed his son into the warm kitchen, where Sylvie was standing at the stove in a worn flannel shirt, and the windows were fogged with steam, and the radio was playing something low that he didn't recognize, but that fit the room exactly. She turned and saw him with the 2 coffees and the children's book, and she smiled, slowly, with the particular warmth of someone who has stopped protecting themselves from something and is deciding to trust the season instead. Early, she said. I know, he said. Theo explained the policies. Theo explains many policies, Sylvie said, taking her coffee. She looked at the book. Is that, for Theo? It's about how the heart works, for ages 4 and up. I thought he'd have notes. Sylvie laughed. Theo appeared at Colton's elbow and looked at the book with intense evaluation. I'll read it after eggs, Theo said. There are probably errors. Probably, Colton, but I'll tell you which ones are real and which are just simplifications for younger kids, Theo said charitably, because I know I'm advanced. Theo, Sylvie said. Mama says that's not humble, Theo told Colton, but she also says honesty is important, so I think I'm navigating a tension. You are absolutely navigating a tension, Colton said seriously. He sat at the kitchen table, and Sylvie set a plate of eggs in front of him, and Theo climbed into the chair beside him and opened the book anyway because the no serious things before eggs rule, as he clarified, applied to serious conversations, not serious reading. Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall on the Brooklyn maple trees, quiet and unhurried, covering the chalk drawings on the sidewalk and the potted plants on the stoops, softening everything. It was not a perfect morning. There were still things unresolved between Colton and Sylvie. Conversations they hadn't had yet. Trust that was being rebuilt one consistent appearance at a time. A future neither of them had made promises about. There were still things broken that would take longer than 6 weeks to mend. But Theo read aloud from the heart book between bites of egg, stopping to note 3 factual simplifications and 1 actual error. Colton confirmed 2 of the simplifications and said he'd have to look up the 3rd. Sylvie refilled his coffee without being asked. The snow kept falling, and Colton Reeves, who had spent 20 years being the most important person in every room he entered, sat in a small kitchen in Brooklyn and understood that the most important room was always going to be the one where someone had been saving you a seat.